So as I mentioned, we are in our final week in this series that we have been in for about 5 weeks on biblical character, looking at characters from the Bible and trying to extract from their lives and their stories characteristics that perhaps we can learn from, whether it's the via positiva, things that we should do, or the via negativa, the things that maybe we shouldn't do and we shouldn't emulate. And last week I introduced you to a character that I was not intending to preach on for 2 weeks. In fact, as we thought about months ago when I was putting this series together, I was thinking, well, it'll conclude on Mother's Day. I'll choose a mother character from the Bible who's strong and courageous and encouraging and all those kind of things. But the more I got into this guy, Barnabas, the more I recognized that he kind of epitomizes characteristics that in a meta way stand for kind of an ideal mothering personality or persona. He was encouraging. He was a transitioner. He helped transition from one phase to another in the church. He was a nurturer. He was generous. He gave all of himself to the point where at the end of his journey he gave even his life as a martyr. So maybe it's appropriate that we end with Barnabas on Mother's Day. And in fact, as we work through his life this morning, we've got a number of scriptures we're going to read. Barnabas shows up in a few different places in the Bible, in Luke, in Acts, in Galatians, and a number of places. So I'm going to kind of weave that all together. And as we do, we're going to gather some characteristics from Barnabas' life that perhaps we could seek to emulate and learn from. And in fact, at the end of my sermon, I've got a little Mother's Day card for every one of you from Barnabas to help us all to maybe learn a few things, be encouraged by his life. So when we think about this Barnabas guy, we probably think of him, if you have ever thought of him or heard that name, you think of him in connection with Paul. Barnabas and Paul were a powerful duo. Guys who worked really well together. They helped expand the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news of Christ, out of Jerusalem and the geographic boundaries of the Hebrew people into to the north and to the west and to the east. And they were fundamental in bringing the gospel of Christ as missionaries to the entire world. This was actually their first missionary journey that they took together. They left out of Antioch, went to Cyprus, and back around, and Cyprus was actually where Barnabas was from. He was a Cypriot. I think it's safe to say he is a key figure in our Christian tradition and faith, because really without Barnabas there wouldn't have been a Paul. And without Paul there wouldn't have been the church that kind of was planted and grown into north and to the west and into Europe. Barnabas was a key figure, a key transitional mothering figure that kind of midwifed birthed us from following Jesus of Nazareth in a specific geographical location to the risen Christ and his Spirit let loose in the world and the church that we are a part of today, and we celebrate, as we will next week, with Pentecost. So I want us to walk through the life of Barnabas, and the first time that we actually meet him is he's not spoken by name. And if you want to, you can turn to Luke chapter 10. In Luke chapter 10, we're in the Gospels, and Jesus is about midway through his ministry, and he gathers 70 or 72 disciples together. And oftentimes when we think about the disciples, we think about the 12 disciples, but probably at any given time in Christ's ministry, there were between 12 and maybe 120 different people that followed him closely, men and women, rich and poor, who supported his ministry, learned from him. They were called his disciples, this whole group of people, because they learned at the feet, they shared the fact that they learned at the feet of Jesus, who was their rabbi, their primary principal rabbi. And so in Luke chapter 10, Jesus calls together his disciples, and it says he sends out 70 of them. He sends 70 of his disciples ahead of him. And it's not, they don't name the names of the 70, but they believe that Barnabas was one of them. That's part of church tradition from the 2nd century on. There is this wood carving that I found somewhere. There it is. There are the 70 or the 72, depending on what the translation is, who were sent out by Jesus in Luke 10, and they went ahead of Christ into all of the the neighboring towns where Christ was going to go, and they brought the gospel. Do you guys know the difference between a disciple and an apostle? So a disciple is somebody who's a student, who sits and learns at the feet of a rabbi or a teacher. An apostle is someone who goes forth and goes and takes that news someplace else. And so what Barnabas is he is kind of that unique disciple who was a disciple of Christ, but then also was one of the very first apostles. And in this picture, I did a little bit of studying, and I'm pretty sure that's Barnabas right there. I could be wrong, but he was one of the 72. So he's not named by name in this passage from Luke, but starting in the first verse there, this is what Jesus does in Luke chapter 10. He says, "After these things, the Lord commissioned 72 others and sent them on ahead in pairs to every city and place he was about to go." Now it says 72 others, and so people aren't quite sure if that means it was the 12 disciples plus a 72 additional, or it was the 12 disciples were here and Christ called an additional different group of 72 and sent them on ahead, which would be interesting, which would mean that those 72 had an experience that the 12 disciples didn't. So he sent them off in pairs, and to where he was about to go, and he said to them, "The harvest is bigger than you can imagine." You guys have probably heard this verse before. "The harvest is great, but the laborers are few." Have you heard that? That's a different version of this, Luke 10. "The harvest is bigger than you can imagine, but there are few workers. Go into the harvest." But Jesus says this to these 70 as he's about to send them off. Be careful. Be warned. It's not going to be easy. You are going to feel like you are lambs among wolves at times. So I'm sending you out there. It's not going to be easy, letting you know from the very beginning, but go. And he says, travel light, carry no wallet, no bag, no sandals. And whenever you enter a house, whenever you first get to a house or to a town, say, "May peace be on this house." So if you go out to share the good news with other people, what is the first thing that you should say? Peace. You lead with peace. That's what Jesus taught the first apostles. This is what you do. You travel light, you go in pairs, know it's not going to be easy, and you lead with peace. And whenever you enter a city and its people welcome you, eat what they put before you. You guys ever hear this from your moms growing up? Eat what they put before you. Don't be, "Oh, that's kind of weird. I've never eaten that before. What is this? Is that, do I use my fingers? What? This is kind of odd. I'm gonna opt out." No, Jesus says, when they put food before you, eat it and be thankful. Lead with peace, go in pairs, travel light, and be thankful for and appreciate whatever culture, cuisine is put before you. Don't be a complainer. Accommodate, understand, work with folks. Heal the sick who are there and say to them, "God's kingdom has come upon you." And these 70 get sent out, and they are the first disciples that become apostles, and then they come back to be disciples again, because a few verses later it says they returned to him and they said, "Jesus, it was amazing. People were healed, even demons responded to your name when we spoke your name." And people were healed and demons were cast out. So it was a wonderful experience for these disciples. Barnabas, we believe, was one of them who became apostles. And this is kind of where Barnabas got the beginning of his schooling as to what it meant to follow Christ. How you go forward, how you go out in pairs, how you lead with peace. It's interesting, this kind of pre-learning, this early learning that Barnabas went through. So this is the disciples of Jesus are gathered back together. And as we know, Christ, not long after, was arrested and he was killed. He was resurrected. And then on Pentecost, as the disciples were all gathered together, and it would have been Barnabas and Peter and James and John, and these 72, probably and others, were in Jerusalem for the Passover, and the Spirit of the resurrected Christ fell upon all of them, right? Tongues of fire on their head, they spoke in tongues. So the Spirit of Christ falls upon the disciples in Jerusalem, and they are fired up, they're excited. And they're committed to being the church in that place. And so then, as you read on in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 2 is where we learn about Pentecost and the falling of the Spirit of Christ on the disciples. Barnabas is one of these disciples, but we don't learn about him by name until chapter 4 of Acts, okay? So here we go. In Acts chapter 4, we meet Barnabas by name. And starting in verse 32, and you can just listen to me, or you can try to follow along if you'd like. But Acts chapter 4, starting in verse 32, it says this. It says that all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions were their own. So the disciples gathered together as this commune for Jesus, and they're sharing stuff together, they're taking care of each other, they're breaking bread together. And then it says in verse 36, it says, Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus. Joseph, the Levite from Cyprus, is, in fact, Barnabas. Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, and you guys know what a Levite is? A Levite was the priestly class in the Hebrew. So Joseph would have come from Cyprus, from an island. He had made his way to Jerusalem. He was a leader in the church. He would have been a Levite. He was in the priestly class. But he followed Jesus. It says, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas. So his nickname was Barnabas. The apostles called him that. And that name means son of encouragement. So Barnabas sold a field that he owned, and he brought all the money and he put it at the apostles' feet. This is the first time we hear about Barnabas by name, Joseph, the Levite from Cyprus. What do you learn about Joseph? What do you learn about this guy? Well, first and foremost, he's obviously an encouraging guy. They nicknamed him Son of Encouragement, or the Encourager. So he was one of those guys who, when you found yourself in a room with him or in a conversation with him, he would find something about you to encourage. Something about the way you acted, something the way you spoke, what you were up to. He would find a way to encourage you. Do you have any friends like that? Yeah? No? Right? There are those people that they just have a way of just speaking encouragement into your life. They're worth $1 million, right? Those people that find ways to say encouraging things about you, find ways to reach out to you, maybe send you a card and lift your spirit. Barnabas was one of those kind of people. And it also says here that he was obviously generous. He owned land. Not very many people owned land. Barnabas did. And what did he do with the land that he owned? He sold it. And he took all the proceeds and he gave it to the disciple. He gave it to the community. This guy's generous. He's encouraging and he's generous. He knows what is important in his life. He knows what he's been called to, and he's all in. Right? He has given everything he has. Now, not all of us have got land. Not all of us you're going to be the most intelligent, learned disciples in the room. Not all of us are going to have the greatest talents or whatever. But each one of us has got something that's unique to who we are, something that we can give. And each one of us has the ability to recognize not in others their flaws or what they're doing wrong, but to take a little bit more time and find the things that they're doing right and to encourage them and to reach out to them. I don't think it's a coincidence that these two things are looped here together. When we find ourselves, whether it's in a relationship or an enterprise that we're a part of or a community that we're a part of or even our own faith, when we find ourselves feeling like things just aren't kind of moving forward the way they should, not progressing the way they should, we can, in a way, sometimes find a way to detach a little bit and lean back on our heels, and that's when we start to kind of recognize what everyone else isn't doing right? What's not going, that's not right, and that's not right. Why is he doing that? But when we are all in, when we've leaned forward and we've given what we can give to that relationship, to that enterprise, to that community, it's a lot harder for us to be critical. It's a lot easier for us at those times to recognize others who are in and how we're working together and the work that God is doing in our lives or in this project that we have. The two kind of feed off each other. And Barnabas is an example of that. Somebody who was an encourager, someone who was generous. That's something that all of us can aspire to. Each of us has something that we can give, and we can be all in. And before we get too critical about things that aren't working well in our lives, maybe we need to ask ourselves, am I all in? Am I given the time and the energy and the resources that are necessary for this thing to go? And am I finding excuses to be relentlessly encouraging to those around me? So, the disciples are in Jerusalem. They got this Jesus commune thing going on. They're encouraging each other. They're seeing growth take place. People are coming into the faith. But they're kind of huddled there in Jerusalem. And while Barnabas and Peter and James and those are there, they also start to experience some dissent from other Jews around them and other leaders who aren't happy with what they're doing. And they begin to experience some persecution. And the primary antagonist the person who's really going after this young group of Jesus followers in Jerusalem and beyond, is this young, zealous, dogmatic Pharisee named Saul. And Saul finds out that there are these Jesus followers who are in Damascus. And so Saul takes off to Damascus to find these and to persecute, to hunt down these followers of Jesus in Damascus. And on his way, right, we remember what happened to Saul? He has an experience. He runs into, somehow, the living, resurrected Christ. And Christ speaks to Saul and says, Saul, what are you doing? It's me, Jesus, the Messiah. I am the one you've been waiting for. Quit persecuting these people. In fact, you should join them and they will care for you. And not just that, I want you to take this message of reconciliation and healing and salvation. I want you to take it beyond the boundaries of the Hebrew people. I want you to be my primary spokesperson to the Gentiles. And so Saul has this epiphany. He goes blind. His eyes are opened. He sees the world differently. He's taken care of by the people in Damascus. He starts to preach about Jesus to the point where people in Damascus start getting ticked off about him, and they run him out of town. Get this guy out of here. And so Saul leaves. He flees from Damascus, and he thinks he can find some refuge, some sanctuary in Jerusalem. So he gets back to Jerusalem, and he's trying to find the disciples, these followers of Jesus, and guess what? They don't want to have anything to do with him, right? This is Saul. This is the persecutor. Except for, guess what? There's one disciple in Jerusalem who reaches out to him and welcomes him in. Guess who that was? Yeah. When Saul arrived in Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him. They didn't believe he was really a disciple. Then Barnabas brought Saul to the apostles and told them the story about how Saul saw the Lord on the way. The Lord had spoken to Saul. He also told them about the confidence with which Saul had preached in the name of Jesus in Damascus. After this, Saul moved freely among the disciples in Jerusalem. When we're scared, feeling persecuted, it's really easy to continue that narrative and to continue to kind of hunker down and circle the wagons, especially if we hear that maybe one of these enemies is near. And that's okay. It's okay to know who your enemies are, and it's okay to be a little bit frightened at times. But it's also great to have people like Barnabas who don't just kind of settle with that one narrative, but seek to learn a little bit more. And so somehow Barnabas knew what had happened in Damascus, and he joins Saul, the one that everybody's afraid of, and he talks to him a little bit, learns his story, and he starts to tell a new story. Barnabas is the one who is the bridge builder, the one who is the reconciler, who allows for this crazy, persecuting, young, dogmatic Pharisee to be received into the church. If it hadn't been for Barnabas, there never would have been a Paul. If it hadn't been a Paul, I'm not sure if we would be here today. So thank God for a mother like Barnabas who can reach out and recognize those who are wayward, who might need to be just listened to and brought into the fold. That's what Barnabas does here for Saul. Saul becomes Paul, and he learns from those who are in Jerusalem. And eventually he heads back to Tarsus. That's Paul's hometown, which would be today in Turkey. So Paul's back in Tarsus. The church of Jesus is still centered, kind of huddling in Jerusalem. And then last week we talked about this. We talked about how they were gathered there, Barnabas and James and Peter. They started hearing that this interesting stuff was happening in Antioch, another town way to the north, where apparently a bunch of Gentiles had heard about Jesus, uncircumcised heathen, and they had started calling themselves Christians. They were followers of Christ. And so headquarters isn't quite sure what to do, and so Peter and James send who? Barnabas, once again, north into Antioch, the peacemaker, the transitioner. And so Barnabas, we read this last week, they sent Barnabas to Antioch after they heard the news about what was happening there. When he arrived, saw evidence of God's grace, he was overjoyed and encouraged everyone to remain fully committed to the Lord. I mean, I just love that. It's probably one of my favorite passages in all of Scripture. Something weird's happening, something that wasn't planned. This chaos is happening in Antioch. Let's send somebody up there, maybe get them back in line, send someone from headquarters, and Barnabas shows up, and what does he see? Evidence of the grace of God. As disciples, as apostles of Jesus, when we see things that are going not according to the book, right? When things have gone off the rails, do we have the wisdom or the ability to stop and to see things maybe a little bit differently and see perhaps that the grace of God might be at work? That's another thing we can learn from Barnabas. And then, as we said last week, Barnabas doesn't just bless the people there at Antioch and what's happening. He goes off to Tarsus to get Paul, who was the persecutor of the church, and he says, Paul would be a great person. And somehow he recognizes Paul's strengths. He brings him back to Antioch, and Paul and Barnabas begin to teach there. And it's in Antioch, as the church grows, that we are first called Christians. It's a great story. The spirit of welcome, of drawing the circle ever wider, of seeing enemies perhaps as partners. This partnership between Paul and Barnabas is one of the greater ones in history. And they, together, after they spend some time in Antioch, they decide it's time for them to head out. And so the first missionary journey in the church takes place led by Barnabas and Paul. That's Barnabas on the right, the older guy. And they go through Cyprus and around to Turkey, and they begin sharing this good news of Jesus Christ in all the world. Powerful. As we said last week, somewhere in there, all of a sudden they stop being referred to as Barnabas and Paul, and they start being referred to as Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas takes kind of second seat. But again, he's okay with that. The partnership continues, leaning on each other's strengths. When they finally get back from their first missionary journey and all that they've seen happen among the Gentiles, they were persuaded that they needed to go back down to Jerusalem together, and so they did. And they pleaded with the church leaders in Jerusalem and said, here's the deal. This amazing stuff is happening. Jesus is doing things in the hearts of these folks that we thought were dirty, we thought were not part of us, and even some of them we thought were our enemies. But God is at work there, and you know all of those rules that we have about once you become a follower, you've got to get circumcised, you've got to start eating kosher, you've got all these different cleanliness rules. That's really kind of a hindrance to the gospel, right? You know, everyone loves the Jesus part, but then when you start talking about circumcision and kosher eating and cleanliness, it doesn't seem to work, and we don't quite think that we need to do that anymore. And there's this gathering that happens in Jerusalem. You guys have heard of the Council of Chalcedon, or the Council of Nicaea, when the church got together in the beginning of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. The first council took place in Jerusalem. And it was when Paul and Barnabas came and said, listen, guys, we've got to change the rules a little bit. And the leaders of the church in Jerusalem said, okay, that's okay. Well, we're there. We believe that Jesus is doing a new thing. Nobody has to get circumcised anymore. Nobody has to follow dietary laws or cleanliness rules. And so Paul and Barnabas head back up to Antioch together, where that church begins to grow, become even bigger than the church in Jerusalem. It gets so big that even Peter, the leader of the church, the understood patriarch, makes a trip up to Antioch to encourage the brothers and sisters and the Gentiles there, and he is amazed by what he sees. Paul, in this letter to the Galatians, talks about Peter's visit to Antioch on that trip, and how Peter sat and ate with the Gentiles. That's not something that a kosher Jew does. You don't go into the house of, you don't eat with, you don't associate with Gentiles that way. Peter's like, all right, this is a new thing happening. This is exciting. He sits down. He feasts with them. They have a great time. Until, Paul says, another group of Jewish leaders from Jerusalem showed up who were maybe a little bit more doctrinal, a little bit more traditional. And as soon as they show up, Peter quits eating with the Gentiles and goes over and eats just with the Jews. And it breaks Paul's heart. And Paul says Peter's hypocrisy was so great that even Barnabas was led astray. And Barnabas goes and eats at the Jewish table and hurts the feelings and communicates what at that time was probably an unrealized bias within the church against non-Jews, against non-Hebrews. It seriously hurt Paul's relationship with Barnabas and Barnabas' ability to minister effectively to the Gentiles in Antioch. It's interesting when you think about the different way these two guys were gifted. Barnabas had learned directly from Jesus how to go out of Jerusalem and into the towns beyond, to lead with peace, to travel with another person, to eat what is put before you, to share the good news of the kingdom. And then Paul had been spoken to, ministered to, discipled by the resurrected Christ, who said, you're going to go even beyond that. You're going to go beyond the borders of the Hebrew people and the Jewish religion, and you're going to proclaim my good news to all the world. It seems like as if Barnabas had taken the mantle, taken the gospel as far as he could, and then as he stumbled, Paul picked it up and continued. As they began working out the logistics of their second missionary journey, we learn that they had another disagreement, and they decided at that point to go their separate ways. Paul continued on to the north and the west with Silas and Timothy, and Barnabas reconnected with John Mark, who we believe was the author of the Gospel of Mark, and the two of them went south. Kind of a heartbreaker, but I'd like to believe that somewhere in there, along the way, Paul and Barnabas stayed in touch, learned from each other, prayed for each other, wrote letters to each other. The Bible doesn't say that, but I'd like to believe it. It's not easy, this whole growing and transitioning, the unique gifts and callings that God has given to each one of us, especially within a family. The way we see things differently, the way we're gifted differently. In Luke chapter 10, Jesus sends the disciples, the 70, out, and he says, it's not going to be easy, just so you know. It's not going to be easy. You're going to sometimes feel like you are lambs among wolves. And it could be that Jesus was talking about the persecution, either the verbal or the physical assault that these disciples might experience as they go forward and proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. But I have to wonder, right? The people that can cause the most pain in our lives, when we step forward and share a new thing or try a new thing and maybe deviate a little bit from the path that was before us, the people that can hurt us the most in our lives are not our enemies, but our friends, right? Sometimes our family. When we take the revelation, the gifts, the experiences that we've had that maybe are a little bit different from those who are our friends or came before us, and we begin to proclaim, we get all in, sometimes the most pain and the harshest words that we hear and experience are not necessarily from enemies that meet us, but from our friends that can't understand us any longer. Tradition tells us that Barnabas went on learning and serving and sharing and encouraging and preaching the good news until he was martyred on the island of Cyprus, his home, in the year 61, where he is revered to this day as their saint, the son of encouragement. It is a journey, friends, and it's not easy. Things seldom go according to the plan. And sometimes people respond to the chaos in one way. Sometimes some of us respond to the grace in another way. Each of us has been given gifts and experiences and talents and perspectives that others might not have and might not completely understand. But what unites us is our common call, that we are brothers and sisters of a loving God, a spirit of a living God that speaks into our lives, into our times, into our experiences, into our gifts, and calls us to join in the adventure of faith and life, going forward with others, looking for, advocating for, celebrating and encouraging the good news, recognizing grace and welcoming others into the family. And when we've done our part, to pass it forward and to allow the next generation to speak the gospel and the good news in new ways. So that's a lot of lessons to learn from our friend Barnabas, Not all of them easy, but I think a lot of them very encouraging. And so what I'd like to do this morning, with help from my youth, is I've got a little Mother's Day card for everybody. It doesn't matter your gender or whatever. And it's a card that just has, we'll just say it's from Barnabas to each one of you, with just little reminders of the different lessons that we have pulled from Barnabas this morning. So here is your Mother's Day card. You can put this on the refrigerator or whatever you want to do. But do I have youth in the that can help me out? Stand up, you guys. Start making your way around. I'll take care of the choir. But if you pass this on, you can pass it to the person next to you and say, Happy Mother's Day. And we can all maybe learn from the son of encouragement this morning.